Good morning. So I was reading this morning, a Saturday morning, beautiful morning, and I was reading this morning from a book by Mary Ann Tolbert. It's called Sowing the Gospel. Mary Ann Tolbert. Sowing the Gospel. And it's, the Gospel of Mark, because I was just thinking about the Gospel of Mark. And she has a number of really fine points here. And I thought, hey, wouldn't it be great to just share this? Because what a great book. I encourage you to read the whole book, or at least sections of it, get it from the library and read it, because it's really fascinating. Fascinating to find out about what the Gospel of Mark actually is trying to tell us. Part of our problem with the Gospel of Mark or any of the Gospels is that we read them in English, and we read them in chunks. If you're Catholic, you read them in chunks. At Mass, you don't read the actual Gospels themselves. And to actually listen to what the author is trying to say in the Gospels is truly amazing. So you have to understand the context, and you have to understand the language, you have to understand the idioms that are being said. So I thought I'd share a little bit of what Mary Ann Tolbert actually says in this book. So if you don't mind, if you will indulge me this morning, and I'll read you a little bit from her text. So she says, this is chapter 3. There are sections in here that are very scholarly and rather dull, but that's the way scholars work. We're generally fairly dull people. But anyway, this is chapter 3 of her book, Excellent Study of the Gospel of Mark. She says, in a broad discussion of current views of genre to be found among literary theorists, Thomas Kent comments, certain of our generic expectations or what we expect to encounter when we begin to read a text is determined in part by what we know about a text's history, its author, its genre. Such a claim leaves the interpreter of the Gospel of Mark in some despair. For the history of the production of the text, its intended audience, its location, its date, its author have all been lost in the dust of centuries. Right? We hardly even know who the author, Mark, actually is. During the 2nd through the 4th century, AD, but she says CE, so CE, Christian writers speculated on many of these issues and developed suggestions, often conflicting, that became part of the tradition about Mark. Most guesses about these matters, however, have to be argued from the text itself, and it unhelpfully never names its author or indicates where it was written. From the implications of Mark 13, that persecutions and conflicts were besetting the probable audience, scholars, both ancient and modern, tend to date the gospel in the 60s to the 70s of the 1st century AD, when Nero's persecutions of Christians in Rome were quickly followed by the Roman war against the Jews in Palestine. So whether the audience was closer to Palestine or to Rome, persecution and war would be the state of the day. Think about that for a minute. That's a really interesting point. Every literary work has an historical context, because it's written in a history. And sure, you could go with the Great Books program approach and just look at a text cold without knowing anything about it. You could do that. But really, when you start looking at the context of the thing, it's like, wow, that opens up a whole window. I never understood that before. And when we understand that the Gospel of Mark, one of the first, if not the first gospel written, was written during an era of persecution and war on a regular basis. These would have been people that were on the edge. They were constantly nervous about what was going to happen next. Insecurity and uncertainty would have been the name for the day. Sounds pretty familiar to the current era. Since the gospel, she says, since the gospel was written in Greek, and since the few Aramaic words added are always translated into Greek, the presumed audience was probably mostly Greek-speaking and not familiar with Semitic languages. Since the type of Greek in the Gospel is common or Koine Greek, the main language of commerce and travel across the entire Roman Empire, the fact that the Gospel was written in Greek does not help locate its point of origin. The occasional attempt by the Gospel to explain, with notable lack of clarity, Jewish customs and practices suggests that the intended audience, and perhaps the author as well, were at some distance from the more established practices of Judaism. Hold on. Stop the presses. All my life I've been told Mark was a Jew, right? That the Jewish influence was there. Jesus was a Jew. They lived in the Jewish realm. This was a Jewish thing. But I never thought about this. Where in Mark are Jewish practices described in any kind of accuracy or detail? I mean, they're very rare. And I never thought about that before, but it is striking. Mark doesn't really seem to know what Jews at the time did. Or if he does, it's always like they're filtered through a Greek lens. That's really peculiar. So if that's the case, why does he put his, if I may use the term protagonist, Jesus, why does he set him as a Jew? Why is he a Jewish person? Okay. Interesting. She says, an anonymous author writing in Koine Greek to a Greek-speaking, predominantly Gentile audience during the second half of the 1st century AD is about as specific as our knowledge can be concerning the history of the Gospel's production. Nevertheless, that the author has been taught to write in Greek does give us an opportunity to sketch the Gospel's context a little more fully, for the educational system for teaching Greek grammar remained amazingly stable over many centuries throughout the Roman Empire. The first 2 stages of education, grammar and rhetoric, were taught by a system founded upon imitation of past writers, especially Homer. A system of imitation of past writers. That would then imply that what we see in Mark, the idioms and the images and the constructions, might be derived from earlier authors. Okay. Students were given increasingly difficult tasks of first copying and then imitating in their own words the forms, practices, and figures of the past. Even at the earliest stages of grammatical training, study of correct word choice and arrangement in the use of figures was accomplished by detailed interpretation of classical writers. The pervasiveness of this educational practice means that writers and readers of Greek across the empire, at the earliest levels of competence, were accustomed to conventional figures and rhetorical patterns, and could use them in their own writing and speaking and recognize them in the presentation of others. Could recognize them in the presentation of others. Wow. Wow. That's electrifying. Because, see, when you read Mark now, or when you read the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of John, or Matthew, there are pieces in there, idioms, images that we have to understand. But we try to understand them in our modern context. What we don't do is we don't try to understand them in the context of the time they were written, because we don't know what that context is. And frequently we're not encouraged to try to understand them in that context. So really the job of somebody to understand the Gospels, like the job of anyone to understand any piece of literature, if I can use the term, is to try and understand what were they writing about? What were they writing against? What were they contradicting? What were they imitating? What the term in Latin is matrix. What was the matrix in which they were writing? The word matrix, by the way, has the same root as matron or mater in Latin. It's an Indo-European word. Matrix means womb, the womb in which this piece of literature was created. And if we don't understand that womb, if we don't understand that matrix in which this thing is written, it's very difficult to understand what the thing is actually trying to tell us. In order to perceive, she says, more clearly, the literary milieu of the Gospel of Mark, we need to survey in fairly general terms some of these conventions of Hellenistic literature that might have affected the production of the Gospel. And then in a more specific way, the next chapter can develop a hypothesis about the genre of Mark to guide our reading of it. Whew, dang, that's some heavy stuff. But not utterly outlandish, because it's true for any piece of literature or any artwork. I mean, for instance, if you look at artwork, you look at the expressionist movement in painting. Could that movement in painting have happened in the 16 or 15 or 1400s? No, it couldn't. For 2 very basic reasons, if nothing else. The first is that there wasn't the same kind of malaise or ennui that was infecting the populace at the time. People weren't thinking about certain ideas like the destruction of the entire civilization. They weren't thinking about that before. And that really permeates the expressionist form of art. The other thing is that there were no cameras. The invention of the camera had not occurred. And expressionist art, in many ways, is it's expressing that invention. You look at the famous expressionist painting, literary critics, Nude Descending a Staircase. That's a photograph. It's a series of photographs, photographing movement. And the expressionist painting is trying to capture that photography. But unless we understand that, it's hard to say whether that painting, say Nude Descending a Staircase, whether that painting is important or good or doing anything or why they would have done it that way. When we look at Mark, we have to understand something of the genre of what he was writing in order to understand his writings. Now, okay, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to go a little further. If you want to drop out at this point, that's fine, but I love this stuff. This is great. She goes on and says about Hellenism. And by the way, for those coming in, this is Sowing the Gospel. The author is Mary Ann Tolbert. A really thorough examination of the gospel of the evangelist Mark. She talks about Hellenism. Okay, Hellenism was the Greek culture that had passed to most of the Mediterranean by the time that Mark was writing his gospel. It starts really with the golden age of Athens, there with Plato and all, and even before that, Homer. Homer was one of the major writers of the classical world, writing in the 800s, just after the Dark Ages. And with Homer and Plato, you add then also Aristotle and other, philosophers and thinkers and artists, Praxiteles and writers. And that Greek style of doing things just was all through the Mediterranean, partly spread because of Alexander the Great and his successors who tried to Hellenize everybody. And by the way, for those of you who are curious, the book of Maccabees, for instance, in the Bible, the book of Maccabees is about a Jewish culture revolting against Hellenization because their ruler, the Greek ruler at the time, was trying to force Jews to become Greek, and they didn't like it, so they rebelled against him in this rebellion of the Hammers, the Maccabees. So there it is in the Bible. Anyway, Hellenism. She says, a number of very fine studies of Hellenistic culture exist, and while we need not repeat that material fully, a few of the major aspects of the period clarify why and how people wrote, read, and heard. Beginning with the conquests of Alexander in the 4th century BC, Greek language, philosophy, political organization, and values swept over the Mediterranean world. What I just said, right? From India to Egypt to Asia Minor, Greek education and culture reigned, mixing in various combinations with native civilizations already present. Even the establishment of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC did not shake the dominance of Greek culture. Yeah, because the Romans conquered Greece and the Greeks conquered Rome, right? The Romans, too, adopted, in a suitably altered version, Greek educational practices, artistic and literary values, and general philosophical perspectives. Not until the triumph of Christianity, she puts into air quotes, not until the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century did the eminence of Greek culture begin to wane. It is a tribute to the importance of this culture that, next to copies and fragments of the New Testament, the greatest number of manuscripts of any work that have survived from the ancient world are copies of Homer's Iliad. Pause for just a minute. Our modern world thinks that printed texts have always been around and that people have always printed tons and tons of printed texts. I mean, you go to a bookstore or you go even online now, but you go to a bookstore and you see hundreds of books. You see, and some of them are just cheap, trashy novels, right? But we take for granted the fact that there was enough trees and paper and printing and interest to print these texts. In the ancient world, that doesn't happen. That you don't have that many books. Partly because there wasn't that much demand for it. People didn't read as much. They listened, but they didn't read. And partly because the printing was a very expensive process. You had papyrus and scrolls, not what is called a codex. This is a codex here. You had scrolls and papyrus, and it was expensive, and being able to write all that stuff out took a lot of time. So it was an expensive process to create books. So what did they make books of? What did they write out as scrolls? They wrote out the most important things in scroll form, in written text. And what that meant is when you are looking at some of these texts, like Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, they've come down to us because they were considered to be the most important. And because there were so many of them, they survived the various destructions that occur, the fires of libraries, the burning of libraries, the over time disintegration of papyrus, that kind of stuff. Those texts are what survived. And how does that influence the writer, Mark, here? Well, Mark himself was dealing with written texts, but also with oral stories and images. We have to keep that in mind because when he is writing, he refers to things and we don't have any copy of them. So how do we know what he's referring to? Because we don't have a copy of certain things, and so we have no insight into what he's doing. Homer's Iliad was one of those ones that survived. So those of you who remember Homer's Iliad, right? Great work. Judaism too, she says, by the time of the 1st century, was thoroughly Hellenized, both in Palestine and especially in the diaspora. Attempts to divide sharply the Jewish heritage of Christianity from the Greek heritage fail to recognize the degree of Hellenization already a part of Jewish culture. Instead of Jew versus Greek or Egyptian versus Greek, Hellenistic culture displayed a spectrum of cultural assimilation from more consciously native to more consciously Hellenized. But the positions along this spectrum were matters of differences in degree, not in kind. All were Hellenized. Vernon Robbins' recent careful and detailed comparison of the teacher-disciple cycles in both Greco-Roman and Jewish literature demonstrates overwhelmingly the blending of those past traditions in Mark to produce a work intimately connected to its own Hellenistic milieu. What does that imply? Especially that line, all were Hellenized. The culture of Greece was so pervasive in the Roman and in the Egyptian and in the Jewish world that people, they did Greek things and spoke Greek terms and wore Greek clothing and operated like Greeks without even thinking about it. Imagine for a minute an American culture, because, we're Americans, I'm American. If you're listening to this elsewhere, you're not American, but, imagine your culture. We are speaking Anglo-Norman language. We don't even think about it. We are dressing in a fashion that was developed during the Carolingian Empire. We operate in a legal way using terms that go as far back as Magna Carta. We have sayings and we have mannerisms that trace their roots way back. Shaking hands with somebody, if you still shake hands during this crazy pestilential plague. Shaking hands goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. Certain ways of wearing our hair or certain ways or the necktie, they all have their roots in traditional cultures, that go way, way, way back. And much of our culture is indebted to Roman culture and Greek culture. In a similar way, these people, their culture would have been indebted to Greece, and they wouldn't even think that that was the case. They didn't even consider it odd. They were steeped in it. Thanks, Elliot. It's necessary right now. Because they were steeped in Hellenistic culture, when you look at the Gospel of Mark, we cannot remove the idea that Greek ideas and Greek images and Greek terms and Greek thinking are there in the text. It's not just a Jewish text. It is a Hellenized Jewish text, and the importance of that is pretty darn significant, especially when you try to understand certain things in the Gospel of Mark. There are pieces in there that it's hard to fathom what Mark is getting at, unless he's referring to Hellenistic things that his audience would have understood. Now, here's a neat section. I'm continuing now in this book. This is Sowing the Gospel, and it's Mary Ann Tolbert. And I really, if you're into this stuff, check this book out from the library. It's a lot of fun to read if you just skip the boring parts. Here is a brief section she writes about what the culture was like at the time. And this is really neat because it sounds really, really familiar, okay? First, mobility. The ability of that milieu to establish a common language, she says, koine in Greek, and a common sensibility, paideia in Greek, throughout many disparate regions of the known world had revolutionary consequences, 3 of which may affect our understanding of the Gospel of Mark. In the first place, the Greek ideal of adventurous journey, so central to Homer's Odyssey, became a general reality in the Hellenistic period. Trade and cultural exchange flourished. Physical, ethnic, and social mobility were the order of the day. You know, I said earlier, it sounds familiar. How many of you own a car, right? Everybody owns a car. We go everywhere on roads that are really well maintained. We take it for granted that the car has been around forever. It ain't necessarily so. You know, the automobile under Henry Ford was only really developed on an assembly line at the turn of the 20th century. So the automobile in America was not a thing before the 20th century. And now it's as ubiquitous as socks. We see an automobile in every garage, in every driveway, sometimes 2 or 3 or 7, depending on where you live. You know, the automobile is our modern day horse. And what does that imply? That implies that you are not tied down to a city or a town or a village or a household anymore. When you get sick of something, you get in your car and you drive and you go and you leave. And the mobility of people in our modern era, not just by cars, but by airplane, you know, not so much by train, because trains are fun, but they're really expensive and they're never running on time. But by car and by plane, you can travel almost anywhere right now. Very similar to what they were going through. The mobility of that age is kind of startling to think about, because like people in our 19th century America, you didn't really move around very much before this era that Mark is writing in. Before that era, you know, during the era of even the golden age of Athens, you had the polis, the single city, and you just lived in your city. You born there, you grew up there, you died there, and you knew all the people, and you got married to, you knew exactly who you were going to get married to. You knew exactly what profession you were going to do. And you were attached to a family or a clan that you couldn't really get away from. And that, you know, in a way, there's a sense of like claustrophobia, you know, like gotta bust out and leave your family and do your own thing and be wild and crazy and all that. But on the other hand, there's a sense of security and stability, because you know that your family is your family, and you're gonna move into a profession that's already set down for you, and your city is your city, and gosh darn it, everything's set. And it's nice. It's nice to have that kind of security, right? Yeah, absolutely, Eliot. Absolutely. Because Eliot just wrote, like, how Bilbo Baggins never left the Shire for most of his life. Because Tolkien is hearkening back to an earlier age in English society, even though he's writing in the 30s and 40s. He's hearkening back to 19th century England, where you were born and grew up and died in the Shire, in the same place. And in the modern era, see, we travel everywhere. We get in our car and we go, we ride. We're like Jack Kerouac on the road, you know. Flannery O'Connor has a great line in one of her books, you know, the Southern author, Flannery O'Connor. And in one of her books it says, you don't need Jesus Christ if you got yourself a good car. Right? Because the idea is that if you can get up and leave, you can get away from your worries and your sorrows and your family and your woes. And therefore you don't need salvation, right? Which is not true, but that's her joke. So the point that Tolbert is making here is that during the era of Mark, the society was experiencing a very similar type of mobility suddenly, you know, within the last generation or two, because it only happened sometime after Augustus took hold of the reins of power. In a generation or two, they had suddenly this mobility where they can move around the empire without any kind of penalty. And that, on the one hand, offered people a great deal of freedom, right? Freedom! But on the other hand, it did something negative, too. So she goes on to say in her book, people traveled by sea and by land in pursuit of trade, better working conditions, and, of course, adventure, right? Large cities like Rome, Antioch, or Alexandria attracted communities of people from other lands and other religions. Trade associations often ran hotels for traveling members and assisted foreign members moving into a region to find homes and new jobs. Such mobility fired cultural exchange and assimilation, and a reaction against assimilation, like the Maccabees, right? The Maccabean revolt, to hitherto unheard of levels. This was amazing, this sort of cultural exchange and assimilation. Suddenly it was like the World Wide Web, right? We are one world order, right? Yeah, sure, okay. Religions from the East spread west, carried by traveling native believers and new foreign converts. Judaism, the cult of Isis, and Christianity are but three major examples among many of this pervasive mobility. Christianity is an example of this pervasive mobility, people being able to move around. The missionary teachers of these religions could no longer count on traditional tribal knowledge in their new and very mixed audiences. Yeah, like St. Paul, right? When St. Paul goes to spread the gospel, it's surprising when you find out how far across the Mediterranean he traveled. I mean, he traveled to Malta. I think he died in Rome eventually, wasn't it? And he traveled. That's a long way from the Middle East. So Paul is a great example of people traveling across this empire in order to spread the gospels, to be mobile in this new order. She goes on to say, yet some minimal acquaintance with Greek paideia could often be assumed. Thus, while Paul needed to say very different things to the very different Christian communities at Corinth or Galatia or Rome, depending on their special problems, cultural backgrounds, and relationships to him, he could use Greek epistolary style and rhetorical strategies for all. To find Hellenistic patterns and rhetorical devices at work in the Gospel of Mark, along with explanations of Aramaic words and Jewish practices, indicates its mixed Hellenistic home. Moreover, Mark's portrayal of Jesus as a traveler, constantly journeying from town to town and finally to Jerusalem, whatever its historical or sociological significance, also connects the gospel to the mobility of Hellenistic times. I like that, because I've always wondered this. Did people during the era of Jesus move around all the time? Jesus is going from this city to that city, to the desert, to the oasis, he goes all over the place. He's a mendicant preacher, you could say. Was that normal during the era of Jesus? Whether it was or not, it was certainly normal in the understanding of the audience of Mark, apparently. People moved around. Now again, you got to consider this. We are used to moving around. But if you're moving around on foot all the time, that's exhausting, and there's a possibility of getting robbed, and there's a possibility of being out in the elements, unless you have a fairly stable society where robbers are not as big a deal, and where there are hotels along the way and places to stay, and you don't expect to be attacked in warfare or what have you. People need to eat and sleep. So during the time of Mark, apparently, moving around was a big deal. And so what is Mark doing when he makes Jesus move around a lot in the Gospels? He's identifying Jesus with the populace he's talking to. Jesus is identifiable to Mark's audience, because Mark's audience would have been moving around the same way Jesus was. Mendicant, so itinerant. That's really kind of fascinating. And for us, we don't notice that. We don't notice the fact that Christ is itinerant, because we take it for granted that everybody is itinerant. When your job goes belly up in St. Louis, Missouri, you get in your car, you pack up your stuff, and you go to Chicago or New York or to Minnesota, Minneapolis. Well, not Minneapolis so much, because, hard times. So, reading from this book here, the Sowing the Gospel, a study of Mark by Mary Ann Tolbert, for anybody who's joining me now. The other aspect of this mobility is also fascinating, partly because of why Mark's audience would have identified with this. but also because it really sounds very familiar to us. We are a mobile age, not just in the fact that we have cars and planes and trains and we move around a lot, but because we have the internet and we have technology that mentally makes us mobile. We travel from here to Europe in a flash of the World Wide Web. And for us, mobility, both mental and physical, is we take it for granted. It seems like a great thing and offers great freedom and opportunity. Absolutely. But there's a backlash. And I think this is interesting that Mark's audience felt the same backlash that we feel. Tolbert goes on to say, this increase in mobility was, in the second place, accompanied by an increase in insecurity. As native cultures and tribal allegiances began to break down under the influx of new ideas and the immigration of established families, either by choice or by force, to other regions, the sense of living in a stable universe with familial or tribal solidarity also diminished. The sense of living in a stable universe with familial or tribal solidarity also diminished. Wow. Much as we like the freedoms that we have now, and the fact that we can get up and go find a new job if we need to, or that we can get away from a family that seems to be imprisoning us, one has to also admit that having a tight-knit family or a tribe or a town gives a certain solidity, solidarity, stability to our world view, which when we disrupt those things, we begin to get mentally disrupted as well. The breakdown of the modern family has done tremendous damage to our current world. The breakdown of societal patterns has done tremendous damage to our modern world. You can look at all sorts of things that are examples of this, but perhaps the greatest example is this expressed sense of ennui, of pointlessness, of loss of a sense that there's any purpose to life, especially among the young. Why? Because they've been cut off from every familial or tribal solidarity, or most all, and their education system has been disrupted, their family life has been disrupted, their normal routines have been disrupted. Heck, even their ability to go shopping has been disrupted. I mean, if nothing else, going shopping with your friends is a form of tribal activity, right? And when you're cut off from all that, suddenly you're like, what's the purpose? Why do I even bother getting up in the morning? That same sense of insecurity, that things are unstable, leads one to begin thinking about, is the world coming to an end? Is there a purpose to what we're doing now? Is there any God in heaven with a plan? That sounds a very, very, very familiar idea. So she says that alienation, isolation, and anxiety became the common experiences of the Hellene. Yeah, alienation, isolation, and anxiety. Who's familiar with that, huh? The cosmos bristled with hostile supernatural powers, bent on making human life as unbearable and dangerous as possible, and an inexorable fate controlled the destiny of everyone. Gosh, I love that. Because again, what do people resort to now? They don't think it's providential. They don't think that God has this plan and things are happening for the good. They think currently that, it's just fate. I was fated. This is bound to happen. It's going to, who cares? Of course it was that way. That fatedness, that sense that we're doomed. We're all doomed. Wow, that's shared by the Hellene of Mark's time. That's really intriguing. Whether by consulting oracles or astrological charts, or by participating in mystery cult initiations or the new salvationist religions, the Hellenes struggled against a debilitating cosmic paranoia. A debilitating cosmic paranoia. That's a great phrase. I'm going to start using that phrase for our modern era. We suffer from a debilitating cosmic paranoia, do we not? It's not just that we don't know what our next paycheck is going to be, which is pretty bad sometimes. It's that we suffer from a sense that the cosmos is out to get us. When's the next asteroid going to hit? When's the next plague going to break out? What does it matter anyway? Because we're just a ball of dust hurtling through a universe, right? I mean, that's an amazing point. A debilitating cosmic paranoia. Yeah, really familiar stuff. What does that mean for us for reading the Gospel of Mark? I think it means that, if you're looking for some kind of stability or making sense of things going on right now, maybe reading the Gospel of Mark is exactly what we should be doing. Because if Mark is speaking or trying to speak to an audience that is suffering this debilitating cosmic paranoia, he's not just speaking to his audience in 60 AD. He's speaking to his audience in 2020 AD, right? All right, moving on. We'll read some more here. Among the aristocratic literati, where public displays of such superstitions were sometimes condemned as vulgar and common, solace might be found in various philosophical schools, like the Stoics, the Cynics, and the Epicureans, or in the nostalgic yearning for the ordered and secure past that characterized the second sophistic, the Greek cultural revival of the first centuries. Whichever path was chosen, the underlying desire was for escape from isolation, danger, and death. Yep. Yeah. It's so familiar. I'm reading this about Mark's audience in 60 BC. And again, things don't change too much, right? Times change. People don't change. The underlying desire was for escape from isolation, danger, and death. Paul's stirring affirmation in Romans 8 is the Christian response to precisely this deep-seated longing in the Hellenistic soul. Paul says, "For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." The individual's experience of an increasingly immense, alienating, and hostile universe fueled feelings of isolation, loneliness, and helplessness, says Tolbert. And again, just to reiterate a theme here, does that sound familiar to anybody? I mean, does it sound familiar, the sense that we live in an immense, alienating, and hostile universe? Does that sound familiar? Or does it sound familiar, the increased feelings of isolation, loneliness, and helplessness? Wow, amazing. This is 60 AD, folks. Mark's audience feeling these same things. Hellenes at the time. Tolbert writes, "Consequently, most people in the Greco-Roman world were on a quest for security. Quote, in God or in some other human being. The escape from isolation, the way to salvation, is to find the God or human being who cares about you as an individual. In this way only can you find your social identity. The time has passed when the individual felt he had a meaningful position in society as a citizen." That's from T. Haig, The Novel in Antiquity. The breakdown of many traditional regional, tribal, and familial connections focused attention on the individual, alone, searching for salvation without the social props that had undergirded his or her ancestors. I'm just really startled by this, because I never thought about this before, and this is why it's so intriguing to me. I've always heard the Gospels read either in patches in Mass, as appropriate to the Mass for the day, or else reading the text as a text without actual research into it. But then when I started doing research into the text when I was in my 30s and began looking at the context, I started saying, wow, there's a lot there to be discovered. And now that I'm reading this, and I'm finding out that Hellenistic people were experiencing these things, it's very startling to me. Because, again, the connection, the similarity between their era and our era is We might as well be talking about 2020 America, right? When you say things like the breakdown of traditional, regional, tribal, and familial connections, focused attention on the individual, alone and searching for salvation. That's like something out of the 20th century or the 21st century. And I speak this especially to young people. You know, I'm a father of 5 kids, and I'm looking at them growing up in an era where they are on the net, where they seldom go out, probably partially because of this COVID thing. But how do they find a future spouse? How do they find out what their vocation is? How are they supposed to find out what they're supposed to be doing with their lives? I think there are many, many people right now, young people especially, who are suffering this sense of being alone. You're alone in the universe. And maybe it's not limited to young people. Maybe it's everybody's feeling this to some degree, that we are alone. There's no one coming to help us, right? We are alone. Our sense is that we have to do things completely on our own. You know, I've often heard critique, and I'm going to go slightly tangential, but not entirely. I often hear critique of things like arranged marriages. You know, whenever that's brought up, people object to it, say, yeah, that's terrible, arranged marriages. Yeah, I can see that. That, you know, because a lot of times the father chooses somebody for you who is not a good guy, right? And so the daughter is married off to a guy that she hates. But on the other hand, in such a situation, you'd have somebody looking out for you and finding you a spouse. And now we live in an era where how do you find a spouse? How do you find somebody with whom you can spend the rest of your life? Do you go to a bar? Oh, that finds some quality individuals, doesn't it? Or do you go online to a matchmaking thing? I mean, some of these matchmaking things are just, they're crazy. And you find a lot of people that are not terribly good quality. So are you on your own? Are you alone? Are you having to make things up as you go along? Reinvent the wheel? Seems like a not so good thing. And the audience of Mark was experiencing a similar thing. Cut off from their roots, cut off from their traditional ways of doing things. So that suddenly they were dealing with a universe that was increasingly hostile, that was increasingly immense and alien to them. And they were doing so, they were dealing with it alone, because they had no connections to their tribe or their family or their original town or their polis. So Tolbert says, the image of the lonely Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. The lonely Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. Never thought of that before. Jesus is a lonely figure. Not a Byronic figure, by the way, because that comes later. He's not going around brooding, all the time. That's not Jesus. But he is a lonely figure in Mark. He does not surround himself with cliques and parties and good times and things like that. He's an isolated figure. The image of the lonely Jesus of the Gospel of Mark, accompanied on his way by confused disciples who misunderstand his teachings and then flee when active persecution finally arrives, reverberates with his sense of alienation, isolation, and individual questing that so marks the Hellenistic period. The Jesus of Mark clearly speaks to the dynamics of his own time. Wow, that's interesting. Because again, something that I have read before and noticed before, but never really thought was a big deal, is that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus frequently goes off on his own. Jesus frequently goes through from village to village, trailed by disciples, but not really with any peers, no compatriots necessarily. There's no bosom friend. Jesus doesn't go in and lounge around at parties the way, say, Socrates does. He's a lonely individual. That's just really interesting, because it's the literary character is speaking to a sense at the time that people who were questing for answers felt alone. They felt as though they were on their own doing this. And so Mark is saying, you're not alone. This guy, this Jesus character, is the same as you. Now, he's God and man, it's true. But when you identify with that, and you say, wow, if he was alone that way and I'm alone that way, and he's God and man, and he's the salvation of the world, I can follow that guy. That's a guy I can identify with. It's like in the movie, the Apostle, I forget what it was, Steve Martin, where he said, what would you rather have as a preacher? Someone who is lily white of hue with clean hands, or somebody who had experienced sin and despair and sorrow? Because it's a pretty powerful idea. Okay, so I'm reading from this text here, Sowing the Gospel, Mary Ann Tolbert. And I'm almost done with this because this is the last part in here. This is electrifying stuff. And I'm gonna be quick on this part because I don't want to belabor the point too much. My point across is that Mark, the Gospel of Mark, seeing it in its context, understanding what Mark was addressing, gives a deep insight into why Mark is important and what it has to say for us. Now here's the third piece that she brings in here. Not just mobility and not just the sense of isolation, but also the sense that Hellenized world delved into rhetoric, thought about rhetoric, understood rhetoric in a way that we don't really think about it. She says, in the third place, the increased mobility of the era stressed the value of communication. Skill in speaking persuasively became the most sought after and admired ability in society. Indeed, the Hellenistic period was, above all, the age of rhetoric. Whether rhetoric is defined broadly as the art of speaking well or more narrowly as the art of persuasion, it affected almost every aspect of public and private life. Anyone who learned to read and write Greek or later Latin studied rhetorical theory from the earliest grammatical lessons. Yet even for the majority of people who remained illiterate, rhetorical conventions permeated their universe and their culture, the way they heard and the way they spoke. The goal of rhetorical training was eloquence, but in part eloquence is achieved by balancing one's style of speaking with one's aims. In the classic formulation, popularized by Cicero and later appropriated by Augustine for Christian speaking, the ends of rhetoric were to teach, to delight, and to persuade. The concomitant styles were respectively the plain, clear, ordinary, the middle, decorative or polished, and the grand, ornate or fierce. Rhetorical handbooks explaining and illustrating these theories of decorum were quite common. The oldest text that has survived in full, the Rhetorica ad Herenium, being dated early on in the 1st century BC. Like the rhetorical handbooks, Demetrius' essay begins with basic grammatical issues of word choice and the structure of sentences and the use of clauses and the development of periods, before turning to the practical uses and abuses of styles. Writers of whatever competence in Greek would almost surely have been aware of some of these discussions, and even the beginning stages of their grammatical training. Thus, the rhetorical directives, practices, and admonitions found especially in Demetrius and the Rhetorica ad Herenium, but also in Cicero and Quintilian, may provide an insightful context for studying the Greek of Mark. That Mark lacks graceful periods, extended figures, or light pleasantries does not indicate that the narrative is without rhetorical development, if one understands the variety of styles available to a Hellenistic author. What's she getting at here? She's getting at the idea that the Gospel of Mark is a rhetorical piece. It's also an insightful piece, and it's also an edifying piece, but the rhetoric of the piece cannot be ignored either. That is, what was Mark doing in order to sell the idea? See? To get his audience to buy into it. We do this today too. When we look at a great movie, take Arrival, for instance, by Villeneuve, or Inception, okay? We look at a great movie. It has a philosophic idea it's getting across, but we don't notice the philosophic idea because the rhetoric is what wins us over. And we may go around quoting a movie or referring to scenes in a movie, and the whole time we are buying into the philosophy that the movie is trying to get across to us. Same can be said about advertising, right, on a cheaper level. or about plays or dramas. Mark is not foreign to that idea of selling an idea. So she goes on to talk about Demetrius and his writing and the style. And I'm going to skip a little bit and say, move on to her writing further. This is Marianne Tolbert, Sowing the Gospel. It's a study of the Gospel of Mark. She says, the fundamental basis of rhetoric is amplification of a speaker's positions, arguments, or theses. Such amplification is necessary because of the oral nature of ancient discourse. This is to me, really got me here. The oral nature of ancient discourse, O-R-A-L. Speaking and writing in the Greco-Roman world were done for the ear, not the eye. They're done for the ear, not the eye. Many of the figures listed by rhetorical handbooks concern the sound of language, not the visual image presented. And since one is composing for the ear, many rhetorical strategies concern the use of repetition in small and large ways without eliciting boredom. Repetition without eliciting boredom. So when we're going to understand the Gospel of Mark, one of the things we have to consider is that he is repeating sounds in Greek, of course, but in the translation we have to see them too. He's repeating sounds throughout the gospel so that they would hook into the ear. How does this work? In our modern idiom, think of a musical tune that repeats things over and over again, okay? I'll give you one, and this will date me, but big old jet airliner, don't carry me too far away. Big old jet airliner, 'cause it's there that I got to stay. Okay, sorry, I'm dating myself. The repetition of big old jet airliner, though, sticks in the head. And if you've ever had this experience where you wake up in the morning and you've got some tune rolling in your head and you can't get it out, that's what we call an earworm in popular parlance. It's something that has stuck in your head because the sound of the words repeated, coupled with the music, hooks that idea into your head. And that's kind of what Mark is going to be doing. He is doing something like what Steve Miller Band does in his song, or what Creedence Clearwater Revival or the Beatles, or any of these rock groups that you wake up in the morning in your head, you're like, why is that in my head? The sound of the words conveys an idea, and it hooks the idea in the head. So when we see the sound of words in Greek repeating over and over again, that's a rhetorical device. Similar to when we see an image repeating over and over again. The image might repeat in different forms throughout a text or throughout a song, right? But that repetition is done rhetorically so that it sticks in the head. That's an interesting thought. Okay. It says, many of the figures listed by rhetorical handbooks concern the sound of language, not the visual image presented. And since one is composing for the ear, many rhetorical strategies concern the use of repetition in small and large ways without eliciting boredom. Because you don't get bored of Steve Miller Band, but you might if you listen to the same song over and over. I don't know. The line between speaking and writing, hearing and reading, was a very narrow one. All reading in the Greco-Roman world was done aloud, and often the author would be the reader of the piece to the audience. All reading in the Greco-Roman world was done aloud. There's a little historical tidbit that that's so alien to us. But when Boethius is writing, and that's in the if I'm not mistaken, 800s, I think, AD, there's a comment about how interesting it is to hear somebody read silently, to see somebody read silently, because it's very new, it's very novel. And that means is that in the ancient world, you always read aloud. You never sat there going like this. You read aloud all the time. Imagine that in a world where people were reading, if they were reading, they were always reading aloud. When St. Augustine has his moment in the Confessions, where he's agonizing over whether he should convert or not, or how he should convert, or why he doesn't convert. And suddenly he hears a little child singing take up and read, almost in a sing-song voice. That would have been a common thing, to hear someone else reading a text, tolle lege, and that I think it's reflecting back on this idea that society was always reading aloud. They read without moving their lips. And now, in our society, if you read aloud or read with moving your lips, it's seen as, oh, you're kind of stupid, because why don't you read silently? It's not the way they did it. It's an interesting thought there. Mark was designed in order to be read aloud. The author here, Tolbert, Mary Ann Tolbert, goes on to say, indeed, of the 5 stages of rhetoric, the first 3, invention, arrangement, and style, had to do with the composition of the work, while the last 2, memory and delivery, controlled its oral performance. Composing and performing were part of one complex task and were intimately related to each other. The difficulty of distinguishing between speaking and writing is well illustrated by the case of Isocrates. He was revered as one of the finest rhetoricians in Greek history. His theories of rhetoric probably had greater influence over Hellenistic schools of rhetoric than the work of either Plato or Aristotle. And yet, Isocrates never delivered a speech orally. His entire reputation rested on speeches he composed for others to deliver, but he was hailed as a great orator. Not speeches alone, but histories, poems, biographies, and of course drama were all performed orally and were composed and judged by rhetorical principles. The reading aloud of all types of texts was a fairly common practice during meals in wealthy homes, and even when one was alone, one would read aloud. Thus, all ancient discourse had a speaking voice behind it, even if the speaking voice was the reader's own. The Gospel of Mark, then, like its counterparts up and down the aesthetic scale of Hellenistic literature, was an oral text, A-U-R-A-L, text, a spoken writing, a performed story. That's something we don't consider. Mark was a drama, a play. It was a performed story. This oral nature of the gospel is one source of hermeneutical difficulty to modern readers, for the contemporary sensibility is dominantly visual, right? Not oral. We don't sit as an audience and listen to a 3-hour opera or symphony. We just don't. I mean, some people do, but the majority of people don't do that. We don't listen to other people read, generally speaking, unless we're listening to on books on tape or something like that. When Lincoln debates Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates back in the 19th century, that was like it's like a 6-hour debate or something like that. It was a tremendously long debate, and people sat through it. They listened to this debate. I mean, they brought picnic lunches and they took breaks, but they actually paid attention. That's startling. I mean, our audiences today, we'd have a hard time with that sort of thing. But the Gospel of Mark was written for people to listen to it orally. You see, for us, she says, to see, quote unquote, metaphorically, means to understand or to comprehend. But for the author of Mark, to hear meant to understand. That's why he says in some points, he says, those who have ears to hear must hear. And it is the word that they hear. I don't know if any of you remember, but I remember when the church, the Catholic Church, began printing the daily readings in a little pamphlet for everybody to read along during Mass. I was young at the time, I think I was in my teens. But when that happened, people stopped looking at the pastor who was reading or the deacon who was reading, and they began looking down at their text this way. And God help us when they started putting it on the cell phones, that people actually started whipping out their cell phones to look at their cell phones and read along in their cell phones. And there's a distinct difference between those actions, not just the cell phone and the book, but there's a distinct difference between listening and receiving the word, like receiving the seed into the ground. The word given from somebody else, with all their inflection and interpretation and dramatic power, versus you reading it with a little bit of wah, 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 wah in the background. There's a huge difference. It's, by the way, it's one of the reasons why I've never done this in Mass. But this, low battery. This difference is significant for the Gospel of Mark. And I'll finish up with this. Not only the style of the Gospel, but also its content, its vision of existence, to use a singularly inappropriate modern phrase, is primarily aural. Becoming sensitive to the ear orientation of the Gospel is one important way to begin to hear it differently. Okay. And she goes on to talk a little bit about pleasing the hearers, to entertain them, because that was very important in rhetoric. Entertainment allowed people to buy into things. And so Mark was also written to entertain. Not just for edification, but entertainment as well. And she has a little note here, which I'll share with you and then I'll quit. She says, one pervasive tendency in modern homiletics is to develop sermons on gospel stories by painting a picture of the episode. So the warmth of the day is described, the weariness of the crowd, the little boy with his fish, or the little girl with her bread, and so on, until the congregation can see the story of the feeding of the multitudes. However, that's not the way the story is presented in the Gospels. What is happening between the Gospel story and the sermon is the shift from oral hermeneutics to visual hermeneutics, for it is visually that a modern congregation understands stories. The minister is functioning often unconsciously as a mediator between hearing the word and seeing it. Such a necessary task might be more effectively done if the minister were actually clearly aware of what he or she was doing. Now, just to stress, I've been reading here from Sowing the Gospel by Mary Tolbert, and I strongly encourage you to just check it out if you get the chance to. It's really quite the read. Study of Gospel of Mark. If we think of the Gospel of Mark in its context as a sort of almost like a movie script that's appealing to an audience that feels isolation and loneliness and cosmic dread or cosmic paranoia, suddenly that gospel becomes alive. It becomes something that really speaks to us, and we can actually have an insight into it, which you can't have when you're just trying to study the gospel in words on a piece of paper alone. Imagine if instead of that, you were seeing it as a movie script, that this was a script for a movie, and that you were hearing that movie delivered by somebody who knew what they were doing. That would be a totally different experience. Wow. Well, I thank you for indulging me in listening to this. This is Sowing the Gospel, Mary Tolbert, and I'm going to sign off now because of low battery and have to move the day along. So to all of you, have a pleasant day. God bless you and your families. Take care. Stay healthy and stay happy too. Happy Advent to you all.